Welcome to Leaders in Conversation. I'm Ariel Johnson, the Executive Director of the DC Charter School Alliance. And today, we're having one of the most important conversations we've had on this podcast. We are in the middle of the 2027 budget season in DC. And for families, educators, and school leaders who make up the public charter school community, what happens over the next few months will have real consequences for classrooms, for our students, and for the future of public education in this city. Public charter schools serve nearly half of DC's public school students. And while some may try to diminish the importance of that, I can say with certainty, as someone that has local and national perspective, that DC is one of the few blue cities in this country that is close to market share while maintaining collaborative, innovative, and diverse options. We have public charter school students in every ward of this city. The families who have chosen charter schools deserve the same investment, the same resources, and the same commitment from their government as every other public school student. We understand that Mayor Bowser has proposed a 2.55% increase to the uniform per student funding formula, which we will discuss in detail later. And while we acknowledge her commitment to public education, that commitment must be to all public school students. All students deserve to have a fully funded education system, facilities that keep them safe, warm, and dry, and the resources to pay educators well. As the final budget takes shape, the DC Charter School Alliance is calling on the mayor, the chairman, and other council members to ensure that charter school students are not left behind in the per-pupil formula, in access to state-of-the-art buildings, or in the wraparound supports that enable schools to serve the whole child. This budget season, we are fighting for 6 priorities that will help our students thrive, and today we'll be discussing 2 of them: the per-pupil funding formula, UPSFF, and the charter facilities allotment. Our schools are navigating challenges on multiple fronts, such as rising costs, growing student need, and an uncertain fiscal environment. And the resources they receive from the district must reflect that reality. And I couldn't think of 2 better people to help us make that case than the guests joining me today. Pat Brantley has spent more than 2 decades building Friendship Public Charter Schools into one of the most respected charter networks in the country. And she's been fighting for DC's children since the charter movement began here. She is also board chair of the DC Charter School Alliance, so technically she's my boss. Pat is beloved in this sector, but please do not confuse her kindness for anything other than that. She is from Jersey, and that comes out when she's fighting for students and families. And Bisi Oyedele, CEO of Education Forward DC, has dedicated his career to the belief that high-quality public education is transformative. He's seen the data on what sustained investment makes possible. As DC's Ed champion, he navigates both national and local funder politics while ensuring that the schools that show the most growth and success get access to the funds that make a difference for our most vulnerable students. Okay, y'all, let's get into it. So thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to have you all. So you all don't know, but I get to work with these 2 people all the time. I said that Pat is my board chair, but Bisi is also one of our strongest partners at the DC Alliance, and someone that I call pretty regularly when something is going sideways. So thank you so much for being here and joining us. I'm going to start with Pat. So when we talk about equitable funding for public school students, what does that actually mean? Why is that important for our students and families?
So let's talk about what funding comes to students. What happens in public schools, or should happen, is whether you are public traditional school or public charter, there should be the same funding. Why should people care about that? Let's say you got 2 of the greatest teachers. One of those teachers can go into our traditional system where there is sort of an idea about the amount they're supposed to get. But if they come to a charter, there's simply less money for them because there is an equity. And so the charter might get $50,000, but the traditional system might get $70,000 for that teacher. Where's that teacher going to go? At the end of the day, we have to think about the stability that all of our children need. And with equity, we all get the same amount of money to make sure that we've got fair pay for our teachers, learning environments that are state-of-the-art, and that really uphold our promise to put kids in safe, beautiful spaces. And we ensure that we put money into the programs kids need, not try to do it just by hand to mouth. And I think that that's critically important. Children shouldn't suffer because adults won't make fair decisions.
You've been doing this work for a really, really long time and have really helped to shape the way the charter community and the charter movement, what it looks like in D.C. It wasn't always like this. We weren't always fighting for equity quite in this way. Can you talk about where you think that shift and that change happened?
I can talk about what it feels like.
Yeah.
I can talk about what it felt like at the beginning when we were told, our families were told, and our children were promised that they would get the same resources, but they could make the best choice for their children or for their child. And what parent doesn't want to make their best choice? And that parent knows that best choice. And so in the beginning, a student came to our school, they went to the DCPS down the street, and they got the same amount of resources. Fast forward for probably what was 10 or 15 years, the law didn't change. Mm-hmm. The calculations behind it didn't change, but people started tinkering. And so along the way, people decided, hey, we've got these charters. This is a system that is thriving. I don't know why there were all the changes, but what I can tell you is that we stopped celebrating and protecting the parent's choice and started saying, how do we enrich one side by weakening another?
Yeah, but you talked about the law, and we talked about this in a previous podcast. The School Reform Act is very clear about what we do to one side, we do to the other. We have historically been a two, technically three-sector system, and we were supposed to be investing equitably into both of those sectors per the law. And to Pat's point, we're just not doing that right now. And we're seeing, over time, the erosion of what is supposed to be one of the strongest charter laws in the country become muted by people, as you say, tinkering around.
Let me add something to that. The overall strong law is still in place, mm-hmm. but things get added as amendments or et cetera that weaken. And I don't know how many people still in the city remember that what charters were supposed to get for facilities was a 5-year rolling average of what was spent for DCPS. The ultimate difference of that is hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Right, of dollars a year, and that is critical. So when you walk into your child's public school, you should expect to see science labs, lunchrooms, teacher workspaces, classrooms that are not too hot and not too cold because the HVAC works. You should not see water coming down the walls because the roofs are maintained. Whether you live in a house or you live in an apartment, you live in a protected space, you know what it's like when that space is not maintained. We are ultimately saying by finagling with the interpretation of the law or attempting to change it and weaken it over time, that some children can go into buildings without HVAC, with roofs that leak, with classrooms or buildings that have no science lab and no library. That ultimately is unfair, and that change needs to be corrected.
I want to be really clear because I think it almost sounds like hyperbole, right? Like, why would we have schools where the HVAC isn't working or like where we're not able to fix a roof if a shingle falls off? That happens. It happens all the time. We get schools that call us and say the fire alarm is going off and no one's responding to it. Like, these are things that are happening regularly and it's not being addressed. The capital budget that DCPS gets, and they deserve every single dollar, right? But it's like $450 million compared to our 180. That's a huge difference. And that money goes quickly when you're talking about half of the district's public school students. So can you just talk a little bit more in detail about what that means for friendship?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The first thing, though, that I want to say, every DCPS child deserves a state-of-the-art building.
1,000%.
And so that what I don't want people to hear is take from one to the other.
No.
What I want people to understand is lay the foundation so all children are in appropriate spaces. At Friendship, we have over 1 million square feet of school buildings and school space. It's an incredible responsibility. And so we have to think every day when we look at the amount that we might get for facilities, what is it that we are actually doing with the money or what are we not doing? It is not just at Friendship. Every charter leader is making a decision about whether they decide to put in a new HVAC system. At one building where the system was so loud, I'm like, the teacher is shouting. I have to fix this. I can fix it, but can I still do tutoring for the kids that need it, right? Can I put off replacing a roof for another 1, 2, 5 years? Because if I do that, then I can offer summer school for more kids. If I don't bring in a new library renovation, can I then give my teachers a fair raise? Just imagine those trade-offs every day, every charter leader, which is, do I serve my kids well or do I ensure they're in a space that's safe? And I just want to raise safety for something. Those are things that charters pay for. We have to ensure that our buildings are safe places. And so we've got to spend on security systems. You've got to spend on those upgrades. You've got to spend on things that are really important. It's a promise to families that people need to understand, yes, I want beautiful spaces. I want safe spaces too. The people who are helping to make these decisions, they need to understand what they are sacrificing for our children.
That's right. That's right. It is, you talk so much about, you have a lot of square footage and the responsibility of that because of your role as board chair for the DC Alliance. You also, and because you are Pat Brantley, you get to see it from a bunch of different perspectives too. So you're one of the biggest networks in the city, but you work with a lot of smaller and single site leaders to try to help them navigate that as well. Can you just speak a little bit to what that might look like for them? They may not have as much square footage to deal with, but those decisions are even more critical when you've got 200 kids.
Oh, it's urgent.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an emergency, and there's no other way to put it. If you have, one building, 8 classrooms, 200 students, then the impact on a lack of a quality facility is felt very strongly. But what else happens? You might not be able to get the kind of debt that allows you to be at a 3% rate or a 2% rate. Instead, you're at 6 or 7%, or maybe even what's predatory. You may not have the capacity to negotiate for a lease so that it's fair. And I want people to think about this. Anybody who's attempted to buy a house or get credit or et cetera, you know what it is to have savings, to have an income that people look at. So you imagine in a smaller, that's like when we got out of college, right? Yeah. I mean, you didn't have like a job history, you didn't have an et cetera. You didn't have those things that people might deem good credit. And so you're just getting charged more. And I raise this all the time. Interest rates don't buy you any more space. If I'm paying 3 or 4% a year, but a small school has to pay 6 or 7 because people don't think that the per pupil for facilities is fair, they're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars or more for the same space, and that is coming out of their teachers' pockets, their students' programs, right, and creating a better facility.
I also want to just back us up a little bit because I think sometimes we jump right into the nitty-gritty of the conversation and forget that some people don't understand or know that when we say we don't get facilities access, we have to go through actual banks. And when Pat talks about things being predatory and interest rates, these are things that traditional districts just will never have to deal with. They have district-owned buildings. When we're trying to finance for a construction project or an upgrade, we have to deal with the actual system, and that's unique to our sector.
It's not only unique. I feel that people, individuals have tried to buy a house, they tried to do whatever, so they understand the situation of what you need to do to qualify. And so it always makes me scratch my head when I see really smart people sit at the table, whether they're at a council hearing or they're sending in letters or et cetera, and say, charter schools, so if they have this money, they have these reserves. Well, if the bank that Friendship uses to get the loans for its building doesn't see that we have any savings, you know what they do? They raise the interest rate. Mm-hmm. And so ultimately, I'm seeing people that I think are very smart going to the table, and I'm like, it's impossible that they don't know. But is it purposeful to try to mislead the public about what those dollars mean and how they are being used to make sure that we're actually being responsible with tax dollars? Like, I'm negotiating as hard as possible to say, please, let us have the lowest debt so that we can put kids in the right buildings. And I really want people to understand that, because if you don't understand it, then you are taking money away from the children who need it the most.
That's right. Yep. Bisi, I want to turn to you and get you involved in this conversation as well, because I know that you deal with this and see this with the schools that you serve, but also you have a lens across the sector. Can you talk a bit about what sustained investment in this sector looks like, both from a government perspective, but also from a funder perspective?
Well, thank you for having me. And it's important to know, I think, Pat, you are kind of like my boss, too. So in many ways, in many respects. So kudos to you for your leadership and everything that you're doing on behalf of kids in the city. So I definitely think we have a lot to sort of celebrate because we have demonstrated more so than many other jurisdictions a commitment to equitable funding, and that's part of why we've seen some of the progress. We know that our city, compared to other large urban districts, has continued to show demonstrable progress for students, particularly those students that we see as most vulnerable, right? Students who are at risk of homelessness, students from low-income backgrounds, our English language learners.
Yep.
Like those students have seen steady and consistent gains both on our local assessment, DC CAPE, Comprehensive Assessment for Progress in Education, and the national assessment, NAEP, the National Assessment for Education Progress. Now, again, it's uneven. We know that there's still students who are struggling, and we know that there are significant gaps in how schools have to make these difficult choices, right? And our goal, obviously, because we work across both sectors, is to make sure those disparities, those gaps are reduced and minimized as much as possible. And from philanthropy, like we know our dollars go further and faster when there's strong public funding available. That's the primary revenue source. And as we've seen, unfortunately, through all the things that are happening in our world, philanthropy is not a substitute for public funding, right? It can supplement it, but it cannot substitute for it. And so that's part of what we see from our vantage point, right? The schools that are really doing the best are able to leverage their dollars for the student experience, which means hiring high-quality staff, using high-quality instructional materials, excellent buildings, like all those things. Those dollars are being leveraged the most, right, using the public resources available. And so when we add on, these are things that can be sustained over time because of the commitment that we've made to public funding.
Yeah, because we know, too, that philanthropy is shifting and changing. It's being pulled in a lot of different directions. And so we do need our government officials and agencies to make sure that we maintain that equity that they promised. And while we can talk about, and I do want to acknowledge all of the great investments that have been made to public education and do acknowledge that Mayor Bowser has been a champion for putting money through the formula, I think that's why we get so frustrated because we've made so much progress and we're doing so many great things. When I compare what's happening in D.C. to other places, we are ahead of the curve and have been for a long time. But we don't get acknowledgement for that always. And what we don't want to do is see a backtracking of that because resources are shifting. Because we know, to your point, what you just said, philanthropy cannot fill in the gap if the government decides to shift how they're funding schools. Absolutely. And I worry about that. I worry about that sustainability for students and families.
You raised really important points. Let me just say, we appreciate the philanthropy, and while it may not substitute for what we need in a fair per pupil, we hope that there are continued investments in D.C. because of the way that D.C. has grown. And what I think is critical is I am proud to live in this city.
Absolutely.
And proud to have done so under the mayor that we had. The reality, though, is mayors change.
Yep.
And so I think we've got to speak not just to the history and celebrate what our current mayor has done. We have to speak to the hearts of whoever may be our next mayor, council member, ANC commissioner. I mean, because elections are a reality in where we live. And so what I don't want people to get confused about is what the law says. Yeah. And that is equitable fair funding. And to tinker around at the edges because sometimes we haven't seen it follow what we may think is a true interpretation of the law. But that said, let's look at the pandemic. Yep. A terrible time for learning. I mean, I don't think there's any other way to say it. And also illness, loss of life. There are so many things that shook stability for our kids. But there was a lot of funding that came in from federal sources. Right. And you saw in many schools our return in learning growth from the pandemic was boosted up by that money. Absolutely. Across both sectors. Absolutely. And so what could we do to accelerate it? Yes, we can celebrate particularly what's happened with students that are at risk, with students that are disabilities and that they're growing. But can we be frank about what it means to grow from 5 to 10% proficiency to 20%? It's simply not enough. Absolutely. We should celebrate it. All kids are growing. But is it fast enough? Yeah. And if we can point to resources as being the reason that it's not, then we have to do something different.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think, acknowledging the effort and the work of leaders like yourself is important. And that's part of why I started with sort of like that progress story, but not to suggest that our work is done. And I think more importantly, progress is fragile, right? And that's what the pandemic has shown, and that's often what we're previewing when we're talking about the changing in administration and shifts in council, right? Unfortunately, if we look at the federal landscape, hard-fought gains can be easily reversed if funding is not sustained or not equitably applied, right? And so I think for sure the job is never going to be easier. And I think having to work to convince everyone that charter schools are our schools, right? They're foundational. They employ residents in the city in addition to educating students and preparing the next generation of leaders, right? Like these are our schools. And so the law is there, right? But the commitment and belief has to be there and has to be matched by this understanding that they're foundational, right? They're part of our community. They're here to stay, and we need to invest in them. By not investing in them or not applying resources actually through the funding formula, you're suggesting that you don't care about half of the students' schools as much as you do the others, right? And all the trade-offs that you mentioned play out in access to educational experience for students, right? School leaders like yourself are deciding, do I want to hire a counselor or do I have to fix the roof, right? And those are choices that they shouldn't be forced to make because they're being funded less equitably than other schools are.
Yeah, I mean, and I appreciate that you always do this. You always open up a conversation with the positives so that we are not just dwelling on some of the challenging pieces. And D.C. is a really unique city in that we need not just our local officials, because you just said, Pat, administrations change both locally and federally. And we are living in federal land, right? And so we saw this happen with the continuing resolution last year. If Congress decides to make some changes and some shifts, then we definitely need our local government to protect our students, sometimes against our own administration. And we saw the impact of that pretty directly and pretty clearly. So I think, I want to, laud this current mayor, but I also want whoever is our next mayor, because you all know this, we have elections coming up. We want whatever that next mayor is to understand that this is not just about protecting kids in terms of equity, but it's about protecting our kids from folks who also may not want to see our kids grow and thrive. They may not say it out loud, but that's been very clear in their investments federally when they come down through the district. Okay, Bisi, so the Uniform Per Student Funding Formula, UPSFF, can you describe what that is?
The Uniform Per Student Funding Formula is the vehicle by which funding flows to all students in the city, and it's meant to ensure that students, regardless of whether they're in traditional district or public schools, are being equitably funded. And the dollars follow the student. So all students have access to the choice that they deserve, and schools receive the resources based on the students that they are supporting. It's a pretty unique, innovative approach to ensuring that there's equitable funding for students in our city.
Okay, Pat, so in addition to the UPSFF, there's also the Charter Facilities Allotment. Can you talk about what that is?
Sure. The facility allotment is the funding that charters use to pay for the buildings where students learn. So things like rent and mortgages, security systems, HVAC, maintenance. That's what the facilities allotment provides. And it's important because in traditional schools, they don't have to use their budget for those things, but charter schools do. And so people need to understand that this is a critical part of delivering the education and learning that kids need. Children cannot learn in buildings that are unsafe, buildings that are overcrowded, and buildings that are falling apart. And it's difficult for teachers to teach in those spaces as well. And that's why the facilities allotment is critical for charters.
We talk a lot about, and Pat, you kind of hit on this earlier about the reserves. Let's get into it a little bit. This is both for Pat and Bisi. We talk a lot about how well-resourced schools are. I think there's still this myth that, charter schools have a bunch of money in the basement that they're just, able to pull from, or there's these big, giant philanthropists that are, donating tons of resources. The world has changed. That has not been the case for a very, very, very long time. Can you talk about how we respond to that and why this is still a fight worth having, and that schools aren't? The myth is not true.
For many years, there was this false narrative that charter teachers are poorly paid relative to their counterparts in traditional schools. And someone sent me some data the other day to say it's less than a 1% difference. And if you look at some of our salary scales and what we do to try to match retirement, it's actually better. And so ultimately, you can't do that because you've got tons of cash sitting around. There's just a certain amount that it takes to run a school. And what I'd like people to know is when you look at schools, for most schools, 70% of your money is going into teachers and staff. It's not sitting around because we're all living in some palaces. That's not what it is. It's going to teachers and schools. And so it's just not a reality. The average amount of cash that a charter has, it's just about at the amount that you need to get a loan that they expect you to have. Like if you're, again, I'm going to use the example. If you're trying to get a mortgage, you better have a little bit of money in the bank. And maybe that's 2 months of pay, but the charter board has a requirement that's just about 2 months.
Yep.
That's it. And so anyone can think about if you stumble, if a payment is late, or for us, we get federal grant money. That is reimbursable money. It can be out 3 to 6 months. If I don't have that much cash, then I literally could be in a position of missing payroll.
Can you talk a little bit more specifically about how you make sustained investments in teacher pay? This comes up every single year. Not just that, we're not paying teachers enough, but teachers and educators not, because we don't explain the budget to people the way that we should, how much it takes to ensure that sustained investment. And what Friendship has done, I think, is pretty unique. Can you talk a little bit about how you're keeping your teachers and making those investments?
So first of all, I have the finest teachers anywhere, and I know every school person feels that way.
Wait, but I have to shout out because you have the Teacher of the Year Gala coming up. We are a couple days out from like the biggest party of the year to celebrate how great your teachers are. But go ahead.
To celebrate how great teachers are across the board. When I think about Friendship teachers, I can tell you about teachers that graduated from Friendship high schools and came back to teach in our schools. I can tell you about teachers that have 25, 26, 27 years with Friendship. I can tell you about teachers that are taking students that come in at nearly every grade level. We have, group of students that are coming in and sometimes very far behind, and they will stay with them. After school, Saturday school, summer school. It is not just Friendship teachers. I think people think teachers, they've got the summer off, they're working until 3 o'clock. This is just not true, right? And so for us, we have to invest in our teachers being able to sustain themselves. And the first thing is a competitive wage, right? I am not going to say to teachers, you come to work for us and you make 20% less than if you are someplace else. So we match wages of what's most competitive in the DMV. The second thing is you want teachers to stay. Teachers need benefits. They need maternity, paternity, parental leave. They need wellness days. They've been there a long time. They might need sabbaticals. They need retirement. And if you think about it, in most traditional systems, you simply take 8 to 10% of the teacher's take-home pay. Right? Most charters I know, teacher gives 4%, we match 4%. In some, you give 6%, you match 6%. So that means that we're actually out of no money for a pension, funding more for our teachers that when they decide to retire, that money is there for them. And so I think that those things are unique. The other things that we do is that we really do believe in the development of teachers. So programs so that teachers can become master teachers, instructional specialists, curriculum coaches. Those are all built in at Friendship. And because of that, we have very good rates of teacher retention. I always want it to be better. I'm not going to say that it is where I think we should be, which I hope every school could get to a 95, 96, or 97%. But it's far above the average, and so that we are proud of. We have people that want to return, and when I look at Friendship, out of Friendship's principals, the majority of them were teachers in our school. Mm-hmm. Out of Friendship's instructional specialists, the majority were teachers in our schools. Out of Friendship's academy directors or assistant principals, most, if not all, were teachers in our schools. And that, to me, is important. That goes beyond, I won't say beyond compensation, because at the end of the day, pay teachers fairly. But it says something about the investment that those adults have made in us and about what we've made in them.
And Ariel, can I just go back to your original question, though? I mean, I think obviously that is a tremendous effort and work on your part. But some of those conversations around like charters being funded in D.C. better than other places just have to be called out as slightly disingenuous, right? Because we're not comparing how charters are funded to other locales. We're talking about how does your government fund your schools compared to other schools, right? We're sort of centering that perspective, which is like how are we actually being treated funded in this context. There are many reasons why other locales may choose hostility, indifference, right? In D.C., we say that this is a system of choice that we preserve and that we revere, and we need to match, our actions need to match our statements when it comes to how we treat funding. So when I do have those conversations with folks, I think it's important to note that, with that, there's still an inherent gap, right? And it's already been discussed extensively. It's part of what we're talking about, highlighting different examples, right? But I think I respond by saying, yes, we're funded equitably because half the students in the city go to charters. And the funding is inherently inequitable because facilities costs, capital expenses are covered in other ways, and charters are having to use very innovative strategies to manage their operations and still deliver a high-quality experience for students.
That's right. And I think, just on like the kind of brass tacks of it, too, we don't talk about when we compare to other cities. DC's just a more expensive city. Like, let's just call it what it is. Like, it's just, and I'm not even talking about an affordability crisis. I mean, we are on the East Coast. It is a more expensive city. Trying to compare us to Oklahoma is not the same. It's not the same, and that is not a disrespect to Oklahoma and what they're doing. It just is a different type of city. So it costs more. It's just more of an investment. So when people say, I get all the time, your per pupil is so high, that is what it is to live in a big urban city. Like that's the cost. I think
we're trying to rebuff the narrative of like these are not public schools, right?
Right.
And so like we have to, at least in DC, continue to reinforce and reiterate that.
That's right.
That these are public schools, and so isolating how charters are funded and not contrasting that with the other schools that we have in our city it's not an apples to apples conversation from my perspective.
That's right. Bisi, you get to see a diversity of perspectives because of your portfolio. Can you talk a bit about what you're seeing on the ground when folks come to you and talk about either funding inequity or how they're sustaining their teacher pay? What are some of the challenges that you feel like are being elevated to you as our champion?
Yeah, I think Pat has definitely covered a lot of them, right? And certainly you're highlighted some of the challenges that smaller schools that don't necessarily have the footprint have, particularly when it comes to accessing affordable spaces, right? Many schools that came online in the past 5 years or so actually did so in facilities that are not like their permanent place of occupancy. When you're starting up, you don't have access to capital to sort of have a permanent space, right? You're usually looking for an affordable lease, money that you can reasonably expect to come from the system, right, the city, to cover your facilities costs, but you have to sort of cut your code according to your size. You don't know what your enrollment is going to be. So you have to make some calculated choice about what you can afford up front, which means many schools put themselves in a position where they're able to operate an educational program, but they know they're not going to be able to be in that space forever, right? And so that's a unique problem for small schools and schools that might be growing, right, who are sort of like are at their enrollment capacity and need more space and realize that this footprint just does not work for them, and they don't necessarily have the option to renovate or improve or add or expand, right? And so it just becomes to the point that we were talking about bonds, like access to affordable capital. How do I actually get into the space that's going to allow me to offer the best education program possible, right? It's just a real challenge, and you have even less leverage if you're a one single site school, right, trying to navigate the real estate market and get banks to give you a loan that won't compromise you or make you have to go through all the trade-offs of like paying for this or that, right? And that's just a challenge, and I think it's one that can't be understated. There are many schools that have resigned themselves to being in the space that they're in because they don't know how to navigate the challenge of finding a more appealing space that will actually allow them to fulfill the educational program that they aspire to, right? And I think that does trickle down a little bit into other trade-offs and choices, right? The quality experience for teachers and students might be compromised if they're not able to have the ideal facility. I'm not saying that they don't do their best to retain their students and their teachers, but I'm saying there's some downstream effects to not having the ideal location, right? And if you do have to move, which is unfortunately a reality for some folks because they don't own the space, then those schools really run almost an existential challenge, right, of retaining those teachers and those students, because now you're in a very different location. And we know from many parents who are still exercising choice and sending their kids to different places, like changing that commute or changing where that drop-off has to occur or changing what the bus route is for your child, like it kind of is a non-starter, right? And so those schools have to do extra work, taking extra time and capacity away from the educational program just to shore up their base of support and make sure they can continue to deliver a high-quality educational experience for their kids.
Yeah, that's a whole different level of advocacy. Just trying to do the lobbying of parents to say, you love this community, stay with us, because I think you're right. you change that commute, even if it's 5 minutes, and a parent has to get to work. Like
it's no fault of their own. They're delivering a high quality program, right? But parents have to make practical choices, right? And that's a choice that's being forced upon them by not funding schools equitably or not giving, not providing the facilities funding that actually meets the true cost that schools are bearing for operating buildings.
But what I will say, though, is that like the charter sector generally, we are an innovative group of folks. I have seen some innovation in the way that we think about facilities and some cross-sector collaboration. I've seen schools that will support other schools by having them share space. I've seen some unique building makeups and models, not just in D.C., but I've seen that all over the country. So I do think that when you have a leader who's a hustler and they want to provide a community for their students, they figure it out and they do it in a really meaningful and thoughtful way. I've walked through, I've seen schools in old malls because, listen, when there's a will, there's a way, and you figure it out. And so I just really want to commend our leaders here for being thoughtful and being innovative on how they provide strong facilities, but also the collaboration that I've seen across leaders when a school leader calls and says, hey, I need some support on the facility, and folks step up.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think again, there are plenty of folks that really sort of contribute to making facilities access possible. Definitely want to shout out some of the unique partnerships that I think are on the horizon to potentially support schools with facilities access. But it's a little bit of a backstop. It's no substitute for the main point of this conversation, right? And like the underlying challenge of like making a case that all our schools deserve funding that's sustained and equitable, right? And so kudos to school leaders for finding creative solutions, but we've got to solve the underlying root cause issue, which is funding our schools equitably.
I think that, we've mentioned facilities a lot, and people are finding creative solutions, but you have to ask yourself why. It is because facilities aren't separate from learning.
That's right.
Facilities are the main...
They're a conduit. Yeah.
Yes, they are part of the conditions that make learning happen. And if you don't believe that, just what did we learn from the pandemic? That when you take the physical environment away, learning falls off a cliff. Not because teachers weren't teaching as hard as possible, because I saw teachers planning, trying to deliver across screens, but because the physical environment helps to support the teaching. The physical environment helps to support the learning. And so we can't take for granted that physical environments aren't important. They are part of the conditions for delivering strong teaching and thereby learning.
That's right. So I want to talk a bit about some of the advocacy that needs to happen. We've talked a lot about what the problem is. We know that we have a budget issue right now, and I've said this before in other conversations, but we also acknowledge that this is a very challenging budget landscape. So we're not just saying give us our money, because it is what we're saying is please make sure that if you're going to make cuts, that it's equitable, that it's fair cuts, and that one sector doesn't take the brunt of all of that. So what sort of advocacy should we be doing right now as a sector to push both our council, this current mayor, and also outlooking to the future mayor and council, so that we're not doing this every single year?
It should be united. Mm-hmm. It should be loud, and it should center children.
Yep.
I mean, and probably that last point is the most important, but I'm going to address the first two. It has to be united. No single school or school leader can solve this on their own, right? No one parent can go in and tell the entire story. In fact, I always say to people, I work for Dr. Dorothy Irene Height, the National Council, for many years, and it was an organization founded by Mary McLeod Bethune. And Dr. Height would always say something that Dr. Bethune would say, which if I take one finger and tap you on the shoulder, you might not feel it. But if I take all five and ball them into a fist, I can deliver a mighty blow. That is an important thing for people to think about. If we are united in our messaging, we believe in these children, we support these children have the same needs of any other children, regardless of what kind of school door they walk into, then we can unite and say to people, pay attention to us all together. But those voices have to be united. Council, the community, the public, they have to hear all of our voices saying, this is important, this is why. In terms of being loud, council hearings, State Board of Education meetings, talking to our parents about why potentially we may not be able to have all the resources and things that they need for their children. That is important. But centering it on children, that is sort of a non-negotiable. And so for me, I think about this. Every child in Washington deserves a school that is safe, a teacher that is strong, and a future that is full of opportunity, no matter what public school that they go to, right? And so when I think about that, I think about people wanting to make fair funding a policy debate. It is not. It is a promise to our children. And at the end of the day, the decision to keep that promise is made by adults. And so for those adults who aren't sitting at the table to bring forth a budget proposal, or who potentially aren't sitting there to vote on what that final budget is, what we can do is be united, be loud, be centered on children, and take up the fight.
Bisi, same question.
It was like, well said, well said. It's hard to add to that. But I will say that we're proud to support a coalition called the DC Student Succeeds Coalition, which is almost 50 organizations across sectors who are calling for equity, right? And this coalition is not about pitting sector against sector. It's really making the case that I started the conversation with, which is like, these are all of our schools, right? And that we need to protect and preserve them. And so working together, showing unity on behalf of all students is foundational. And being consistently loud and vocal about the desire to see equity is just going to have to be a feature of our work in order to continue to make this ingrained in the fabric of how we do business, right? Because unfortunately, there's still an argument that some folks would like to leverage around the role that charters play. And we need to figure out how to get all stakeholders at the table, because outcomes for students are not sector specific, right? We're looking at outcomes across our city. We want the net benefit to be positive, and it starts with making fair investments in our space.
Absolutely. I think, I've said this a couple of times and I'll continue to say it. We're the DC Charter School Alliance, so our job is to advocate for the public charter schools in this sector. We know, and parents know, parents don't care about what the governance model of a school is. They want a high quality school they can send their kid to, whether it's, hopefully in a neighborhood, on the route to work, wherever. And none of us got into this work to pit sectors against each other. Many of us were either traditional public school educators, come from public school. Come from a big union, long time public school educators. My mama is still working right now at her local public school. So what we're saying is we just want to make sure that all public school students, because charter schools are public schools, that they all get the same access to the resources that they deserve. But this is never about it needs to be us or them. And I think we need to change that narrative. I think we do a really nice job of it in D.C. We don't see it as much nationally. And I'm proud of us in D.C. because we don't do that, and I don't ever want us to get to that point. We do talk about the importance of both sectors, and we want to make sure that we keep them equal and equitable. Before we wrap up, I want to address our elected leaders directly. We understand that the district is having budget constraints right now. We know that. We live in the same city. We understand there's an affordability issue. We understand there's housing, and there are decisions that our elected officials, our mayor and our city council have to make to ensure that everyone gets the resources they deserve. And we want to be a part of that solution. However, it is critical right now that we fully fund education so that all students have access to high-quality resources. Charter school students are public school students, and when you take away resources or diminish those resources, you are saying that half of the city's students don't deserve access to high-quality education, that the teachers who show up every day don't deserve to be paid at the same rate and the same level. So we are imploring our mayor to give us a fair and equitable budget. And if that can't happen, we ask the chairman and we ask the council to do what's right and put a budget together that ensures that all students across this sector, in every single ward, in every single part of every community, have access to high quality education through a fully funded UPSFF. Put the budget back together that shows that our public school students, that all of them are treated fairly and equitably and equally. So I thank you both for joining for this conversation and for pushing our thinking, and also just giving some color and some context. You two do phenomenal work in your respective spaces, and it's just a pleasure to work with you both in our capacities. I will probably continue to call you with all of the challenges and problems, and I'm grateful that I have you both as thought partners in that work. So thank you both.
Thank you, Ariel.
Thank you.
Appreciate you. Great conversation today.